Welcome to Chapter 6 video presentation. Chapter 6 is devoted to selecting the appropriate contract type for various types of procurements. This video presentation, just like all video presentations in this course, are based on the book titled Project Procurement Management, Contracting, Subcontracting, Teaming by Quinton Fleming. These are the learning outcomes for this chapter. After completing Chapter 6, you should be able to explain the difference between fixed price and cost reimbursement contracts. Those are the two major categories of contracts that will be discussed in Chapter 6, and we'll spend a lot of time discussing various nuances and variations within these two categories. You should also be able to list and briefly discuss advantages and disadvantages of fixed price contracts. And the same thing for cost reimbursement contracts. You should be able to discuss various advantages and disadvantages of this group of contracts. You should also be able to explain how incentive fee provision works, explain how award fee provision works, and also explain the essence of various variations of fixed price and cost reimbursement contracts. Finally, you should be able to select an appropriate contract type for an IT telecommunications project, depending on the needs of the project and the specific items that you're procuring. Some preliminary thoughts before we go into the main subject matter. There are many contract types designed to provide the necessary flexibility to the buyer and the seller or contractor. But generally speaking, all contracts usually fall into the following two categories. Number one, fixed price contracts, and number two, cost reimbursement contracts. As the name here suggests, fixed price contracts, they include a fixed price that the seller or contractor needs to adhere to in order to meet the rules or the specifications of the contract. Cost reimbursement contracts, they're different. They give more freedom to the seller. They ask a particular seller to perform a particular service or deliver a particular asset or product, and then all the cost, or not all, most of the cost, or all of the allowed cost that the seller incurs while working on this product or service will be reimbursed by the buyer. So this is the second type. Contract types are usually selected through negotiation. Negotiating contract type and product service price are related because a particular contract type may actually influence the final price of a product or service. So those are two interrelated issues: the price and under which conditions or under which contract this price will be delivered. So the main goal is to negotiate a contract and price that will result in reasonable contractor risk and provide the contractor with incentives for efficient and economic performance with adequate quality. So the goal is not to somehow lowball your seller or contractor. You need to give your seller or contractor some reasonable room for performance, but at the same time, all the risk, at least some of the risks, they need to remain on the side of the seller contractor. A contractor cannot be one-sided where either the seller or the buyer bears all the risks. So there needs to be a fair distribution of risks, and also the contract needs to be written in such a way where it provides the necessary risk protection for the buyer, but at the same time gives the seller or contractor incentives to show good performance on this particular job. So this is the main goal of drafting and negotiating a good contract for a particular procurement need. Some other preliminary thoughts. Most private and government organizations prefer to use the firm fixed price contract, or FFP. Now, as the name suggests, there's a firm price being included in the contract. FFP gives organizations the necessary security. So many government branches, they like to be in a position where they have high control over prices. They don't have any surprises. They don't face as many risks as private companies. So that's why they are often used by government entities. By the way, firm fixed price contracts, they make a lot of sense. They're a good option if you know exactly what you want to buy as a buyer. You can describe what you need with precise details. If you cannot describe what you need with precise details, then your contractor or the seller may say, well, I'm not sure what needs to be delivered, I'm not sure how much money I will spend on that, and that's why I don't like this firm fixed price contract. But if you can describe to the very detail as to what exactly you need as a buyer, then your seller is more likely to agree to a firm fixed price contract. And also you need to understand that firm fixed price contract may be constricting not only to the contractor but also to you as a buyer, because if it's a firm fixed price contract, it will be also based on very detailed and firm specifications. So it will limit your flexibility too, because you as a buyer may not be able to change those requirements throughout the duration of the contract, or you will be able to change them, but the seller or contractor will come to you and ask to renegotiate the contract. For example, most likely they will ask for a higher price. So yeah, each departure from these points on your side can result in an opportunity for a seller to renegotiate the contract. So since you will be on the breach side of the contract, it gives the seller an upper hand in negotiations to ask for a higher price or extension of deadlines, or some additional flexibility in terms of the product requirements or specifications. So once again, all in all, there are two major contractual options or categories. We'll discuss those options in a bit more detail here, but again as a summary, and then we'll start talking about the details for fixed price contracts and cost reimbursement contracts. So fixed price contracts, they place greater risk of performance on the seller, because the seller will accept a particular price, and then it becomes the problem of the seller to deliver a product or service within that price. Now, naturally, those kind of contracts need to be structured properly. They need to have adequate level of detail so that at least the contractor or the seller can understand what it takes to deliver a product or service and how much it will approximately cost. That does not remove the risk, but at least it gives a better ability for a seller to foresee how this fixed price contract is likely to impact their bottom line, and overall how likely they are to complete it within the fixed price that was agreed upon. Now, cost reimbursement contracts, they're on the opposite side of the spectrum. They place less risk on the seller, because the seller is merely obliged to provide best effort commitment to complete all the work specified in the contract. So in other words, the seller needs to be working on the product or service specified in the contract and just show best effort, meaning it doesn't mean that the performance should be at the lowest price possible, but if a seller can show that best effort has been done, then all the cost will be reimbursed by the buyer. Okay, so this puts buyer in a more risky position and the seller in a bit less risky and more flexible position. Just to give you an example from the start, fixed price contracts are often practiced for routine buy, something that already exists in the market, something that is fairly, not necessarily simple, but something that is fairly understood. For example, buying some sort of a commodity, right? Something along the lines of, purchasing milk, okay? Although there could be some nuances, because sometimes if it's a long-term contract, then fixed price contracts may have some room to adjust price based on economic conditions. But generally speaking, buying milk is a straightforward business transaction, and both the buyer and the seller may go for a fixed price contract. If it's something that is not a commodity, something that is very ambiguous, let's say a consulting service, then most likely it will be done at the cost reimbursement contract, under a cost reimbursement contract type. So a team of consultants agree to work for your organization to find, let's say, a problem that causes the company lose money, but there's no fixed price. They just need to show their best effort in finding the root cause of your financial problems, and then you'll compensate them on a per hour basis. So those are examples of the kind of procurement relationships that seem to fall into either fixed price contract or cost reimbursement contract category. So let's talk about fixed price contracts in more detail. As the name suggests, the defining feature of this type of contracts is that the total price is included in the contract. So the contract will say the following company agrees to deliver the following product or service for a price of X. Now, some of these contracts may include a firm price, meaning there's a definite price and the seller needs to agree to it no matter what, or adjustable price. Adjustable price contracts may include some options or some variation in the final price. For example, adjustable price contracts may include a ceiling price, a target price, or both. So for example, the contract will say, you agree to deliver something for $100,000. However, you may go up to 120, and after that, all the cost will be bared by the seller, right? So I'm not willing to pay for anything above 120. But even If you go between 100 and 120, there may be some penalties, or there will be like some provision where the additional costs are shared equally or unequally by the buyer and seller. So adjustable price contracts have some flexibility, some variation in the final price. Of course, if you're talking about adjustable price contracts, then price may be adjusted only using the mechanism specified in the contract. It's not that there's no price. In other words, it's not that the final price is up for negotiations, right? It's the mechanism for deciding the final price specified in the contract. When buying simple commercial items, or not necessarily simple, but things that are already available in the market, procurement officers usually use a firm fixed price or fixed price with economic price adjustment options. So firm fixed price means there's a firm price and there's nothing beyond that. Fixed price with economic price adjustment means something like the price is fixed, but it's dependent on economic conditions. For example, if you're buying milk, especially if you have a contract for buying milk in the long run for several years, then you may agree that depending on the market prices of milk, there may be some adjustments for milk. Let's say it will go up or go down depending on market conditions. This is also very common in the energy sector. For example, a particular organization may sign like a long-term, let's say 5 or 10-year contract for, let's say, buying natural gas from a particular producer, okay? And they will agree on a fixed price for this natural gas. However, this fixed price will be linked to oil prices because natural gas and oil prices, they're typically correlated. When oil becomes cheaper, then there is typically less consumption of natural gas, as some industries, some companies can switch to using oil as their energy source, let's say for heating or oil-based products. So natural gas becomes less in demand. So if oil prices go down, then the natural gas contract can be adjusted as well. So this is like a common provision in those long-term energy contracts for natural gas. So yeah, typically the price is set or negotiated at the onset of a relationship, even before the final contract is signed. Most fixed price contracts are firm fixed price where an absolute value is placed within the contract. Now, of course, sometimes the fixed price will be adjusted to provide incentives to the seller to spend less. For example, under this modification, if your seller delivers something at a price that is less than it was agreed upon, let's say due to better efficiency or new approaches or new technologies being invented or some market conditions, then a portion of the savings will actually be kept by the seller. So there's an incentive for them to perform at a lower price because they will make more money at the end. Or, as I explained before, sometimes the fixed price is adjustable based on economic conditions that are beyond the control of both parties. For example, if you agree to build something made of metal, let's say a garage or a building, and then something happens with major suppliers of construction metal parts, or the price for ore go up, that will bring prices for metal and various metal components and parts up, and that's why you will not be able to deliver within the specified price. So in that case, the price will go up depending on the market conditions or economic conditions. One of the key features of fixed price contracts is that obligations are largely placed on the seller. The seller must produce within the agreed upon price range, or deliver the specific price that was agreed upon. So no additional payments for contracted work will be provided to the seller, so they need to do whatever it takes to be within the specified limits. Fixed price contracts are usually straightforward. You just agree on a price, both parties agree, and then the seller tries to deliver within that price. So there's less managerial oversight. However, if payments on a fixed price contract include partial payments depending on the progress, then of course it gives more managerial headache, because you need to do a periodic inspection to make sure that the seller is on track and is delivering what was agreed upon. Although it adds additional managerial overhead, it may be a good idea, especially if you're buying something very expensive. Then both buyer and seller, they want to be confident in the seller needs to be confident in your financial position, and you need to be confident in the fact that they have all the necessary financial resources to produce what you need, and they're on track with this project. So partial payments for partial work completion may not be such a bad thing, especially for high-value contracts. Since risk is largely on the seller side, then one would imagine that the seller would require a higher profit margin. This is the so-called high-risk, high-reward concept in finance. If the seller bears most of the risks, then the margin, meaning the potential profit, needs to be high. So that's the theory, but in reality, this is not always the case. For example, some industries are very competitive, and there are a lot of vendors or contractors or sellers competing for a limited number of buyers. In that case, they will be willing to accept lower profit margins, even if the risks seem to be high on the seller side. However, this is not always a good idea to lowball, to place all the risk on the seller side and put the seller in a position where the profit margins are very low. First of all, the buyer may not know what needs to be done initially. This will require renegotiation somewhere down the road where the seller will have an upper hand. So if you don't know what exactly you need, then you may want to leave some room where you can negotiate what needs to be done. And in that case, if you have a fixed price contract, then seller will have an upper hand. They will try to twist your arms and say, oh, now you're changing requirements, then we want a much higher price. So it may actually put you in a position of more risk and less flexibility. Also, you need to understand that if the profit margins are low, to keep the deal profitable, a seller may reduce cost to the point where quality is compromised. This is something that always happens within the construction industry. A lot of construction companies, they're hard pressed to deliver new houses within the specific price range, depending on market conditions. And then if something happens during the construction project, let's say the local municipality demands higher fees or something like that, they're trying to absorb all those additional costs while cutting costs down. And that's how you get those cheaply made houses that may be falling apart only, or may have cracks in the foundation only after a couple of years. They may be made out of the cheapest materials possible, something that may, at the minimum, make living in such house not very comfortable, or sometimes they even cause health problems on the side of the buyer. So that may not, it may not be a good idea to put your seller in a position where they can only get a very low profit margin, because they will do whatever it takes to lower the cost, and sometimes you don't want that. You don't want to get a product or service that was constructed or performed at the lowest cost possible. Next, we will talk about cost reimbursement contracts in more detail. Cost reimbursement contracts provide for payment of allowable incurred costs to the extent prescribed in the contract. So basically the contract says you as a seller agree to do X, which is a product or service, and we agree to reimburse all of your costs that are project related. So not all of the costs, but the costs that we previously approved to the extent prescribed in the contract, meaning up to a certain amount. So these contracts may still include an estimate of the total cost for the purpose of obligating funds or committing funds to this project from the side of the buyer, and also establishing a ceiling that the contractor may not exceed without the approval of the buyer. So the key feature of this contract is that the obligation of the seller to provide it obliges the seller to provide best effort commitment to complete all of the work specified in the contract without dictating a particular fixed price. So the seller just needs to show the best effort. If the seller inquires all the costs authorized in the contract but does not finish the scope, the seller cannot be sued for the difference. So once again, the legal commitment of the seller is to provide their best effort to finish the job. If they don't finish the job, and let's say the reasons for not finishing the job are not well accepted by the buyer, then the buyer will discontinue the relationship, but the seller cannot be sued for the remaining scope of the project. So while the seller is usually not obliged to complete the job, the buyer is obliged to fund the job to the limit of the contractual obligation. Typically, sellers are obliged to notify the seller if the cost will exceed the authorized funding level, if additional funding is needed. So when notified, a buyer can decide whether to commit additional funding to the project or terminate the contract. So the major concern under this contract type is the opportunity it provides for the seller to be inefficient. For example, the seller, as a part of the project, may include all kinds of idle and redundant capacities just to make sure that the assets are utilized and a higher price is charged or higher fees are charged to the buyer. Some of these practices border on the illegal side. For example, if the seller, the contractor, keeps flying the personnel first or business class when this is something that is not explicitly allowed by the contract, then some buyers may think that the money is being spent at least inefficiently or even illegally. But the advantage that this contract type has is that there's a flexibility that these contracts provide to both buyers and sellers. For example, both buyers and sellers can adjust the direction of the work in a way which is in the best interest for both. Under fixed price contract, these requirements and specifications are already fixed. With the cost reimbursement contract, the buyer or the seller can change the direction of the project, spend more or less if this seems to be in the best interest of both parties. So it provides for greater flexibility for both parties. Also, since the risk on the seller side is lower, one would imagine that this type of contract would entail lower profit margins. But this is not always the case, and sometimes these contracts often provide abnormal profit opportunities to sellers. Those cost reimbursement contracts are often used when a consulting company or any company is hired to create something new, and those pioneering projects may have very high profit margin opportunities for the company performing on this project. Another disadvantage of this type of contract is the need for constant managerial oversight of seller performance, because the work is being performed, the money is being spent, so the buyer needs to have a mechanism for constantly monitoring what the seller contractor is doing with the money that are devoted, with the funds that are devoted to this project. And this oversight is often difficult in the absence of an ambiguous benchmark for measuring seller performance. For example, if the seller or contractor is working on something brand new, let's say a new software product, then how do we know what's the appropriate timeline? How do we know whether an appropriate labor cost for developers is $50 or $100 per hour? I mean, who knows? So it's very hard to monitor and benchmark those parameters of the relationship. Now, any of the two general contract types, fixed price and cost reimbursement, they can be modified using the following provisions. Number one, incentive fee contracts, and number two, award fee contracts. These two are quite similar, although I like this metaphor that award fee contract, they're like a tip, right? Something that may be given to a seller, something that is based on subjective feelings or thinking on the side of the buyer. While incentive fee contracts, they're more like bonuses. They're clear, they're contractual, they're objective. But those two are sometimes quite similar. So let's talk about incentive fee contracts modifications and award fee contracts modifications in more detail. Incentive fee contracts may either include cost incentives or performance incentives. Cost incentives allow to share cost savings and cost overruns by the buyer and the seller. For example, the buyer and the seller may agree on the following fixed price, $100,000. And then there can be incentive fee modification to this contract where, let's say, if the project goes above the agreed upon price, which is $100,000, then this additional cost will be split, let's say 80-20 between the buyer and the seller. Let's say the seller will incur 80% of the cost while the buyer will pay 20% of the cost. And then let's say if the project is actually completed below the agreed upon price of $100,000, let's say $80,000, then the savings of $20,000 will be also split 80-20 between the buyer and the seller, right? The seller will get 20% of that, which is $4,000, and the buyer will get the savings, right, which amounts to 80% of the $20,000. So performance incentives tie cost price to certain characteristics of a product or service, so they're different from cost incentives. So these characteristics need to be objectively measurable. So for example, the contract may say, well, if you create a very reliable system, the one that has an uptime of 99.99%, then you'll get a bonus in the form of additional $10,000, something like that. But it needs to be objective and measurable. In both cases, these provisions are designed to give the seller incentives to perform efficiently, meaning to save money, and also effectively to deliver high quality products and services. So this is incentive fee modification to contracts. Now, award fee modification is more like giving tips in a restaurant. They used to reward the seller for meeting broad objectives such as meeting the overall schedule objectives, exceeding reliability standards, decreasing the number of components in a device. It is usually the buyer who ultimately decides if an award should be given or not. So it's not based on something specified in the contract. It was popular with fixed price contracts, but is also used with cost reimbursement contracts. So it is used to motivate the seller to show excellent performance in certain subjective areas such as quality, customer satisfaction, and it's typically not tied to any objective mechanism specified in the contract. Now, with the two types of modifications to generic contract categories that we have discussed, and even beyond that, there can be many nuances to fixed priced and cost type or cost reimbursement type contracts. And each of those variations are listed under appropriate category. For example, fixed price contracts may have firm fixed price, where there's one price being included in the contract and the seller needs to adhere to this price. It may have fixed price incentive format, where the price is fixed, but there are some incentives for the seller to deliver the product or service below the agreed upon price. In that case, the savings will be shared among the buyer and the seller, or there may be also some provision to go above the price, and then in that case the seller will be responsible for some or most of those additional costs. Sometimes fixed price contracts are under fixed price award fee category, where the price is fixed, but there are some awards for certain rather subjective characteristics of the products or services, such as delivering within the agreed upon schedule, or making the customer meeting the customer expectations and stuff like that. Typically, a fixed price the award fee under this type of contract is decided by the buyer, so it's not specified in the contract. It's up to the buyer whether to give this tip or award or not. And then there are fixed price economic price adjustment contracts, where the price is fixed, however it's dependent on future market or economic conditions. It's very common for long-term contracts, where, let's say, a consulting company agrees to work on a particular software project for several years, and then, let's say, if the IT labor costs go down, then the final price will be adjusted in accordance with the changing market conditions. It also used in long-term commodity contracts, let's say when buying natural gas or oil. So the contract is long-term, but the price may depend on the fluctuations in the marketplace for, let's say, related energy products. Then you have fixed price indefinite delivery quantity contract. It happens typically when a buyer signs a contract with a seller, but the buyer is not sure when exactly the product or service needs to be delivered and in which quantities. However, those conditions can be specified in the contract. The fixed price will be adjusted depending on the date of the delivery and the quantity of the product that is actually shipped or delivered under this contract. So those are some modifications or subtypes of the so-called fixed price contract category. There are also modifications to the cost type or cost reimbursement types contracts. For example, it can be cost plus fixed fee. So it'll be something along the lines to help the seller get started with the project. There will be a fixed down payment or a fixed fee that is not dependent on the number of hours or labor spent after that fixed fee is delivered. So this gives some safety, some sort of startup funds for the seller to get started on the project, and this is one modification of the cost type contract. Then you have cost plus incentive fee, where it's a cost reimbursement contract, but there are some incentives to deliver something objective. Let's say to deliver something within a shorter period of time, or with certain measurable specific characteristics. And then you have cost plus award fee, which is a bit more subjective, more like tips at a restaurant, where costs are being reimbursed, but if there are some subjective criteria being met, then based on the judgment of the buyer, there will be certain bonuses or awards assigned to the contractor or seller. Then you have cost and cost sharing contracts where the buyer and seller, they agree to share cost. For example, the buyer will say, I will reimburse 80% of the cost, and the buyer says, okay, I'll bear the remaining 20%. This happens when the buyer is interested in the contract. Let's say the contract is likely to deliver some or build some assets or expertise on the buyer side that they can reuse in later contracts, or the sheer magnitude of the contract is so large that the seller feels that they will make a lot of money even if they share some of the cost. Then you have cost plus a percentage cost fee. Now, this is an outdated category of contracts and it's not used. In fact, it's not recognized by some government regulations as a valid type of a contract. So it basically means that if you, as a seller, agree to work on a particular project, you get all of your costs reimbursed, and then the more cost you incur, meaning the more work you perform, the faster you perform that work, you get like an additional like a bonus for just spending money. This was done during critical times, like during World War II, to motivate sellers to build their products or deliver services as soon as possible, because it was very important for the war effort. So the faster you work, the more you spend, the more you get rewarded. But nowadays it's not commonly used at all. Finally, there are some other contract types that may be similar or different to fixed and cost type of contracts. Time and materials contracts, used very often in research and education, where, let's say, a team of researchers, they agree to work on a particular project and they get reimbursed for their time spent and the materials that they purchase, that they have to spend on this research project. Then you have labor hour contracts, which seems to be related to cost reimbursement contract, where the seller is reimbursed based on the labor hours spent. Then you have letter contracts. Those are like very simple, light contractual obligations. Let's say a buyer and a seller, they want to start working together as soon as possible, so they will sign a very rough letter outlining their relationship and how they're going to pay to each other. Something along the lines of a high-level contract, and then once they get started, then later on they can fine-tune the details. By the way, letter contract is also a legally binding contract. It's not that, because it's a light version, it doesn't mean that somehow it can be ignored or avoided. Then you have basic ordering agreement. It's something along the lines of a letter contract, or I think a better analogy is a memorandum of understanding, MOU. So this basic ordering agreement, it outlines the basics of the relationship between the buyer and seller, like what would be the delivery terms, what will be the price, what will be the incentives. And then this basic ordering agreement is used as a framework in case the relationship actually materializes, when they actually start doing business with each other. Then the contract that they use for this actual relationship will draw on this basic ordering agreement. So it's not considered to be a legally binding contract, but some companies may choose to operate within this basic ordering agreement without actually signing any kind of legal contract. Typically, it's something related to time. Sometimes it's related to the fact that the relationship is not that important. You're buying very basic stuff, so you don't care if the price goes up a little bit. You don't want to control it that much. Or sometimes it's a matter of trust. For example, Warren Buffett, he has done a lot of transactions with a basic ordering agreement. He would just sit down with the business owner and write down like a small document that outlines how they're going to work together. And then based on this document that is not really a legally binding contract, they will go ahead and transfer ownership of the company. Berkshire Hathaway will transfer some of the money to the owner, and then the owner will transfer all of the stock or most of the stock to Berkshire Hathaway, meaning Warren Buffett's holding company. And it will be done like that, without consulting companies, without lawyers being involved. I know that Warren Buffett, he bought Nebraska Furniture Mart, one of the companies, just like that. It wasn't a formal contract, just like a very unofficial agreement between the owner of the company and Berkshire Hathaway. So those are some other contractual types that may be related to the two main categories that we discussed in Chapter 6.